Welcome back. And as was mentioned earlier in the show, our first topic for today is a conversation with UNICEF Belize. And we have with us at this time Paulette Wade, who is the Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist at the UNICEF office. And we have Ilia Talev, who is the Social Policy Specialist and also the Officer in Charge. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning and thanks for having us.
Good morning, thank you.
Well, Paulette, this is actually your return. You promised you'd be back, and you are here. So originally you had presented to us what were the basic findings of the mixed study.
Yes.
I want to go ahead and just kind of do a refresher as to what mix is, and what information you hope to get out of it.
Okay, MIX is actually a multiple indicator cluster survey. That's what the acronym stands for. It's actually a household survey developed by UNICEF to support countries in monitoring at that time the Millennium Development Goals. No, it has evolved over the years since 1995, and it's now a program that is sought of by many countries, not only now to look at the MDGs, but now the SDGs, and also to support their national monitoring of the situation of children, as well as looking at international comparisons, so you see how well you're doing as compared to other countries.
Now, how is the mix different from a household survey conducted by SIB, for example? What type of information does it get that gives you the clearer picture?
Okay. I think that the multiple indicator cluster survey is one of the largest surveys done in Belize. This year we did 5,242 households, which is around 20,000 or so respondents. This is a little different because it focused mainly on women and children. And I must say again, for the first time we addressed the situation of men. Men were interviewed for the first time. And so we look at the health status of women because, of course, of their childbearing years and the fact that they are the host of babies, no? Yes. And so we looked at mothers and the care for their child in terms of looking at their prenatal health care that they do, the number of checks they do when the child is born, whether or not the child is attended by a skilled birth attendant, or if that birth happens in a hospital, whether or not they get their first check. And then we track basically the child health over 5 years. No? And then we also look at other factors that might impact the woman and the child as it relates to their sexual behavior, their HIV knowledge. And for now, we looked at access to mass media, and again, tobacco and alcohol usage.
And of course, it's done on a periodic basis, so you can actually track progress for the country as well?
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about some of the major findings. You actually presented them last week, the detailed information. Let's talk about some of the major indicators that we saw coming out.
Okay.
Well, first of all, it's very important for us to also mention, as you, Marlene, just said, that we had collected this information for the purpose of informing the public about the situation of children, women, and men in Belize. But that's just one initial step. Of course, at this stage, we are right now sharing that information with all the key stakeholders in Belize, in the hope that we can identify some of the reasons behind what we're seeing and what the numbers are telling us. You know, whether there's progress between the past mix, which occurred 5 years ago, and this one. If we see progress in the data, we see why is that progress happening? What have we done as a country, as government, as civil society, as UNICEF to make sure that those numbers improve? And in case we see some negative trends, we also identify the reasons for those as well. And then we hope to identify policies, activities, actions, whatever it may be, resources that may need to be allocated to improve those resources, to improve those statistics, I'm sorry. So we had a meeting, a sectoral consultation, we called it, with key stakeholders from government, civil society, media, and other key stakeholders per sector, looking at the individual data in the area of health and nutrition, education, early childhood development, justice, violence, etc. In all of these areas, we had technical experts from government, from civil society, to help us interpret a little bit the information and the data. This happened over a 3-day period last week.
Yeah.
We successfully completed those consultations. We were able to identify some of the reasons behind some of the numbers. We can talk a little bit about some of the key progress that we have identified compared to the mix 5 years ago. For example, in the area of exclusive breastfeeding, we have nearly the doubling of children now who are exclusively breastfed compared to 5 years ago.
Yes.
We have nearly doubling the number of children who are attending early childhood education, for example. However, we do have some serious figures that are showing, for example, the prevalence of violence in households hasn't been reduced as much as we would have hoped to. Still, about 65% of children experience some kind of violence in the household. About 43% of them experience physical violence. But we also identified, for example, in one of the groups that was dealing with violence, that only about 25% of parents actually believe that children should be physically punished. Now, this is a very high number, but we're looking at half of the parents who actually practice, violence
Don't want to.
So we also see an opportunity here.
Yeah.
We can actually tell that parents are causing children violence without believing that it's successful, and the reason why they're doing that is because they do not know of alternatives.
Any
perhaps,
other way.
and we need to be actively engaged with all of our partners to demonstrate what that could be,
Now,
what that alternative could be.
One of the opportunities that comes from collecting data, and it's really why I think it's so important to most agencies, is to be able to understand if what you're doing is working. And I know as a funding agency that is very crucial to you as well in terms of partnerships for development. If you look at exclusive breastfeeding, for example, there has been a sustained effort in helping to educate mothers and mother-to-be's. There's been the establishment of baby-friendly hospitals, and all of this information has been, it's trickled out into the public who aren't even reproducing, that they know it's important. When it comes to the area of violence, I use that as an example to compare to violence. We talk a lot about it. And I know you fund some programs for positive development instead of getting involved in violent activity. I know there's some parenting programs that take place as well. From your consultation with the sector, what are some of the whys that you were able to come up with as to why we're still facing this violent situation, even though there has been some effort?
I think that and before we get to that, what we noticed from the study as well is that it's children that are between the ages of 3 and 5 that experience the most severe physical punishment.
Wow.
And so I think it's sometimes what came out was that some parents need support. Parents don't know alternatives to not beating, and sometimes you feel that you're not a good parent if you don't hit your child to ensure that the child goes the right way, and so I think that the key message that came out is that we must educate parents more. We must have programs that support parents in looking at alternative ways of disciplining their children. And I think the focus also has to be on young mothers as well.
And what we can also tell when we look at the numbers, and then this time we also looked at some of the disaggregations of those numbers, we see that there's not huge discrepancies between urban and rural settings. There are some, but not necessarily indicative of the prevalence of violence in rural versus urban. However, we do notice, for example, in communities where we see other types of violence among adults, armed violence, such as Southside Belize City, we also notice that there's an increase, higher rates of violence against children. And this basically is supported by other social scientific studies that say that if you experience violence as a child, you're much more likely to actually commit violent actions when you grow up and when you're an adult. Also, when you grow up in that kind of environment, this violence becomes a social norm. It becomes accepted and tolerated. So we've noticed also trends between, or positive correlation between social and economic status and education status of parents with the prevalence of violence in those families. And of course, poorer households also tend to be, children growing up in poor households tend to experience violence more than children growing up in richer households. That does not mean to say that, I do not mean to say that there is no violence in households that are well off. There's also violent practices there. However, the violent practices there are, or the violence that children experience in those households is less frequently physical, but more often psychological, verbal, etc. So these are kind of the trends.
Education level, it's the same, more educated, less violence,
Exactly.
less educated, more violence.
Exactly. We assume that that's, of course, linked to the educational opportunities that also children have in those families, as well as the options and the availability of information in those households in general, because then those parents would be typically those who would be more exposed to alternative practices, those who would be able, who we are able to more easily reach through social media, who have access to internet and mass media, where we can reach with messages of positive alternatives to violence. And of course, if you live in areas where you do not have access to those that kind of information, and you do not have access to that kind of knowledge, of course, you're more likely to use methods that you believe, or sometimes even do not believe they work, but you still use them as because there's lack of alternatives. Exactly.
Yeah, that is definitely an opportunity and something that we would love to see addressed. And unfortunately, the issue of corporal punishment is still one that people automatically become very divided about.
Yes.
But what your indicators are saying is something different. Half don't hit. Which means you're making strides there. And of the half, almost half, sorry, Paulette, almost half that does, half of that group don't necessarily want to.
Yes.
So I can see the opportunity there. Let's move into some of the other indicators that you have seen. And we have up here, of course, this is the health, the overall health of children. And this is one we've heard actually coming out from UNICEF very often about stunted growth, underweight, malnutrition. Let's talk about what we're finding there.
Okay, in terms of stunting, I think that from the last mix to this mix, stunting has decreased.
Okay.
And the ministry, through this consultation process, has indicated the efforts that they have been putting in place to ensure that parents are more knowledgeable of what children need in order to not be stunted, in order to not be too short for their height, for instance, too thin for their height, too light for their age, and too big for their age in terms of obesity. And obesity, even though we see it as only 7.3%, is a major issue, especially in Southside Belize. And we know that children who remain obese when they hit teenage years is more likely to develop some sort of non-communicable diseases, which is one of the most which is the highest prevalence rate among adults in our country in terms of diabetes, hypertension, and that sort of thing. And so it's also important, equally important, for us to start looking at obesity. It's even prevalent in Toledo, where you say, oh, it's only stunting.
Where you used to have more problems with stunting before.
But it's
if
also
look at this
obese.
Graph, it's very much clear. If you see underweight, which is blue, and stunted, which is red, are both moving downwards, versus overweight, which is purple, is a sharp increase.
Right.
Yes, in terms of the exact numbers, yes, you've noticed the trend. We have, just to cite also for the audience, I think underweight percentages are 4.6%, while overweight is 7.3%. So we are considering this to be an indication also of the prevalent practices of nutrition and what parents give or do not give their children to eat. And again, another opportunity for us to intervene with educational programs about healthy food and healthy lifestyle. Obesity seems to be of concern, and while we do have usually a lot of people do not necessarily consider it as a serious issue as underweight, obesity itself can lead to a number of problems for children, for the health of children. So we are considering in our next country program, which begins in January of next year, and it will stretch until 2021, to also provide technical and other kind of support to the Ministry of Health and other actors to support programs that address the issue of obesity as well as malnutrition.
Absolutely.
I know that for the next, for the new NPA, National Plan of Action for Children, I know the name has changed. This is one of the key indicators that will be monitored for children, as well as stunting, because as you've seen in the graph, the high rise in terms of children and the number of children who are now obese in our communities and the various districts.
And it is reflective of the wider society. I believe it's 2 out of every 3 persons are overweight or obese.
Yes.
So if the adults are in that situation, we see our children moving in that direction, then it seems that we have to do some healthy living focus.
Yes, and I think that all this goes back to education.
Yes.
Again, it's key, and you'll hear this message in most of when we look at what are some of the interventions we need. Parents need to be more educated in terms of what are some of the nutritious foods that children should be given, because a lot of times, if you notice the growth chart of children while they're being breastfed, the growth is normal. It's after that,
it's
when we start introducing the soft drinks and the chips and the the biscuit, that these things shift in terms of children development.
Well, typically what we hear is it's what they can afford, they'll feed the children. So look as to what they're eating. It needs to be done as well.
Yes.
Whether it is in fact a cheaper food or less expensive food, or if it's just poor choices overall.
Yeah, and the Ministry of Health recently conducted a survey that did with focus groups with mothers who had children who were showing some sign of malnutrition and mothers who didn't. And questions that were asked were, what food were available in your community? And what do you actually feed your child? And so the next step after that is to look at how to teach mothers within these communities with the food that they have access to, how to make it nutritional enough that the child receives the amount of nutrition per day.
I want to move now, in the interest of time, to another area that I think is very crucial to us, and that's the area of reproductive health. We want to talk a little bit about teenage pregnancy. You call it adolescent birth rate, but it's teenage pregnancy. And I think in an era where we're still we're struggling with getting HFLE information into the schools. I understand there's some resistance for HPV vaccine in some areas. Other places it's been embraced. Let's talk about what the mix is showing.
Well, in terms of the adult fertility rate, the rate is 74 per 1,000. So 74 young persons, well, women between the ages of 15 and 19, one of 1,000, for every 1,000 young woman between that age, 74 of them have a child or are pregnant with a child at the time in which the mix was conducted. But if we were to unpack that information, you will see that female sexual debut starts very early. The mix show that over 36% of young women have sex before the age of 15. Which is a lot, considering that they are not even being tested for HIV. So yes, we want to say that the health education is necessary, but I think that it should not be left only to the schools.
Absolutely.
Parents has a role to play in ensuring that your child understand the risk of early sexual debut and what are all the repercussions of that.
You said 36%?
Yes.
Before 15?
Before 15 years.
Which is second, third form?
Yes.
Okay. So did you do any question relating to the level of knowledge or exposure to health or reproductive health information before that age?
Well, what we looked at was their knowledge, comprehensive knowledge of HIV.
Yeah.
And so when we look at that same age group, their comprehensive knowledge is about 43%. very low.
Yeah.
So if they're having sex without the right knowledge as how to protect themselves, then they're at risk.
Yeah.
You know, and pregnancy is not an only risk. They also risk, there is also the risk of HIV.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
And perhaps, again, just to, I guess, we always treat education as panacea for all of these problems. And I think, while it may appear repetitive, I think it is never enough, we cannot overemphasize the importance of education. Since we see a lot of prevalence, early pregnancies, which then, of course, lead to other problems in life. Early marriage is a result sometimes of early unwanted pregnancies, which again then causes later problems in later stage. We try to identify with our partners what are some of the reasons behind this. We try to identify some correlations between who gets pregnant early in life. What are the sort of the hot spots in the country where this happens, and what are some of the target populations? And we again notice that among girls in poorer households tend to get married, for example, tend to get married earlier. Boys in richer households tend to get married earlier. Then girls without education tend to get married earlier. The south side, Belize City, again, I will stress out as one of the areas. Toledo is another area where the early marriages happen. Again, this is, we looked at all of the possible correlations to identify some of the reasons why this is happening, and what is it that we can do together with the ministries, but also perhaps partners with whom we have traditionally not partnered around this issue. And that's, for example, the Council of Churches and the religious leaders and their role and they can play in informing the public and informing especially the parents and children, about the risks and about the benefits of continued education, which they're perhaps sacrificing if they get pregnant early or if they get into early union. So we're looking at a variety of interventions that we hope to implement next year to be able to address some of these issues.
Now, looking overall as to what the picture was painted with the release of the findings, and especially having the conversation with those who are directly involved in these interventions or programs in these areas, what stands out to you the most as perhaps an area that really needs focus, that perhaps has been not as recognized and brought out through the mix? And what stands out as an example that has really been successful?
I think overall, in terms of an area that needs focus, and it's throughout the indicators I said, we need to pay special attention to the adolescents. And that is one of the areas we are looking at, how to unpack this data to see what are some of the issues that adolescents are facing, because there are so many red lights on various indicators, as we mentioned, over time.
Yeah.
And so there has been the call from our partners to say, let's look closely at the adolescent population to see how we can address this issue and change the lives of these young persons within the age range of 15 to 19. So that, I think, was constant throughout that intervention. In terms of positive, I think the whole idea of the ECD and what has been done nationally in terms of looking at ECD from an integrated approach.
Yes.
And
early
seeing,
childhood.
Early childhood development, and understand that it doesn't have to happen within a concrete wall, that early childhood and stimulation can happen anywhere. I think that is positive for us, and for me coming out, I like that, because I believe that early beginnings bring brighter future. And so if we can ensure that more parents understand that yes, early childhood development is important, but it's in terms of stimulation and getting, reading to your child and interacting with your child, can ensure their better development over time. So those are my two takeaways from that 3-day session. I don't know for Ilia.
I think there's the general takeaway. We've noticed an improvement across the board in a variety of indicators. We have noticed that not just our programmatic focus is UNICEF, because UNICEF is a relatively small player. In the major player here is the country, the state, and all the civil society organizations, the schools, etc. Those are the implementing partners of UNICEF, but those are the implementing agencies that are responsible for social programs that we can attribute some of this improvement in the general situation. If you notice what really made me think a little bit, one of the questions is asking people about whether their lives have improved over the past year, and then whether they're optimistic about their lives improving in the next year. So we're looking about 75% of people who said that their lives, on average, men and women, that their lives, have improved over the past year. But about 93% of persons believing that their lives will improve further. So we need to capitalize on that optimism. Yeah. I think when you look at the pockets of where this optimism is concentrated is in areas where we have intensified our programming interventions, the Southside Belize City, in the southern districts of Toledo and Stan Creek, and also in other areas. So we need to make sure that we continue with our intensive programming and intervention in those areas. Yeah. I want to emphasize that this is the beginning of the process, that we have completed the data collection, which is very difficult to do, and it's
almost 20,000.
20 exactly. So it's considerable amount of information that we've been able to collect. This is the data that's going to drive our programming and hopefully the programming of the government and partners over the next 5 years until we get the next mix. There's a wealth of information here that we need to encourage everyone, all the researchers, academia, media, other agencies, to use this information to inform their studies, to inform further analysis, because we've just scratched the surface, so to speak, on the potential of that this information could have. And evidence-based programs are the only ones who have been proven to work. We can have ad hoc piloting programs, we can experiment, but only evidence-based programs are the ones with long-term impact. And so we hope that this is what will eventually result from the availability of this information, more evidence-based interventions.
Yeah, just to add to Ilia, in terms of the data that Mix collects, we always say that what we produce in the report is only 1/3 of that information. But we have the data that has been collected, and there are numerous ways in which this data can be unpacked differently. That you could see different situations, looking at ECD against violence, for instance. I know for us, we're looking at the multiple indicator, the multiple dimension index, looking at poverty from more than an economic point of view, to say that. But there's so much you can do, so much wealth with that information. And
one great opportunity I see from your information is you need to get online for everything.
Yes.
Which we've learned, in practice here, and it really is amazing to see that. Because the question always is in Belize, does everyone have access? But you're looking at almost over 70% of persons 15 to 49 are accessing technology.
Yes. 64 for women and 69 for men. Age 15 to 24. Which is very high. Of course, we do not know what people use the internet for. The other indicator that is linked to this is about 1/4 of men and women have exposure to mass media, and that is a little bit disconcerting in a sense that because we'd like to think of mass media as one of the primary venues to access to provide information to persons. So we hope that the combination of using ICT and modern technology and social media with mass media will be effective in reaching those audiences.
And packing it on by age is also important too. I'm sure there's some groups that will use mass media and some groups that will be more IT focused. And I don't want us to miss the opportunity to talk about the area that perhaps we'd like to ignore, which is alcohol use among our families and children, alcohol and tobacco use.
Well, the data suggests that 53.7% of men and 29.3% of women aged 15 to 49 had at least one alcoholic drink during the last month. So we're looking at double the rate of men versus women, but this is considerable, in the sense that alcohol use and tobacco use is but above all alcohol, is very serious. So we're looking at at a problem that needs to be addressed, and my understanding is that the country is trying to address this issue. Tobacco, my understanding is also that tobacco regulating legislation is also is currently being prepared. So hopefully that will affect the results, because we look at it, 16% of men and 2% of women. There's a huge gender discrepancy of who use tobacco and tobacco-related products. Again, we cannot understate the importance of intervention in this area and the potential damage that alcohol and tobacco use can cause, especially with children and especially pregnant women.
Yeah. Now, I want you to complete an exercise with me, because oftentimes we talk numbers and people, it perhaps may not resonate as much as when we can put it in a story that they understand. So I want you to tell me, I know UNICEF, Belize, and other agencies, in your partnership with other agencies, have worked consistently within the South Side. There's been a concentrated effort in trying to help children. So let's go with a young boy who is 6 years old in the South Side Belize City. What is the mix saying about his life today?
Okay, in terms of the mix, there will be a gap, because we look at boys under 5, and then we address them 15 years old.
Okay.
So
let's say that 4-year-old boy.
Okay, a four-year-old boy.
4-year-old Tariq.
4-year-old Tariq might not have been exclusively breastfed, because girls are more likely to be breastfed. He has less chances to access ECD, early childhood.
Preschool.
Preschool or outside.
Okay.
He would...
Is considerably more likely to experience domestic violence. And that is a very serious issue. But for children under 5, experience of domestic violence. That boy is also very likely to live in a very unfriendly environment, because we also ask, one of the questions we ask the participants is how happy they are with the living environment, and boys especially boys in Southside Belize City and men have expressed concern about the living environment. That boy is also very likely not going to complete primary school, and it has significantly less chances of enrolling and completing secondary school. We are looking at also boys from Southside Belize City experiencing stigma and discrimination. We're looking at those boys also being less considerably at a disadvantage compared to their peers in other districts in virtually all of the areas of the mix. We've seen progress in the South Side.
He may be vaccinated. He most likely is vaccinated.
Access to health services, access to the government programs, the government services is there, but there's social circumstances that make access to those services a little bit more difficult than in other areas of the country.
So it definitely shows you why the work continues, even if some of the indicators are showing improvement. And from what you just explained to me, and I chose the boys specifically, we know they tend to be more vulnerable. It seems that the boys are still lacking behind in some of the social support.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Anything else you'd like to tell us about? I didn't see my favorite topic being covered, which is child participation and feeling like they can't express themselves. Was that included?
No.
Okay.
Not this time around, but in mix 6.
Yeah.
Yes, but it is an area. I mean, one of the things we will continue to do is as Paulette said, the study on adolescents. We will look at adolescents in depth, and adolescents are the ones that we also seek to include in our programming in terms of participating in the planning of our interventions and identifying what kind of interventions will be most effective. By the way, adolescents are still children, but they will, having just grown up a little bit.
They don't like being called children, so we call them adolescents.
We call them right, and you should know as your former life. But anyway, just to say that UNICEF is also supporting each of the municipalities, all 9 of them, in establishing what we call children advisory body. And so these children met last week Friday with all mayors to discuss what are some of the issues that they are facing in their municipalities and how some of these can address. And when you look at what are the issues that they were speaking about and what the mix is saying, that the data, right, is valid of the reality of Belize. And so we're hoping as well that the mayors take these children's concern into consideration in their planning for 2017.
No, it was fascinating. We had the advisory board for San Ignacio, I believe, on at one point in time. And they were children who were able to identify safety issues.
Yes.
There were children who were able to express concerns about public drinking and how that affects their safety, and even just the landscaping and layout of recreational areas.
Yes.
So there's a lot to come from them as well. Yes. So what happens now?
Well, as I mentioned before, we're continuing now analyzing this data. In the next, in January 2017, we will produce the final mixed report, which is going to have the analysis of, and a lot more disaggregated data in the analysis of the sectoral meetings. And then throughout 2017, we're planning a series of studies on specific aspects, in-depth studies on specific aspects of mix, violence, adolescence, and whatever else. Also, the multidimensional poverty index which we have produced based on the mix, we will publish in 2017, and continue to share this information and to use it for our planning and to encourage our partners to use it for their planning.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming in and breaking down the data for us once again. We appreciate it, and we'll have you in 2017 to do the follow-up as well.
Okay. We look forward to the invitation.
We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking about the primary and secondary art skills training program and their electronic art book. So stay tuned.
You better watch out, you better not cry, better not pout, I'm telling you why. Santa Claus is coming to town. He's making a list, checking it twice, gonna find out who's naughty and nice. Santa Claus is coming to town.
Gift yourself this Christmas with the Belize Bank. Our country, your bank.